Almost everything about the modern world was argued into existence on a few rocky peninsulas and islands in the Aegean Sea. Democracy, philosophy, history as a discipline, geometry, theatre, both comedy and tragedy, the Olympic Games, the atom, first imagined here 2,000 years before we could split it. The very idea that the universe runs on rules you can figure out with your mind, rather than the whims of gods, was born in ancient Greece. And here's the strange part. Greece was never a single country. It was hundreds of small, fiercely independent city-states, scattered across a landscape so mountainous that neighbors could barely reach each other. They shared a language, gods, and games, but they spent most of their history at war with one another. Out of that endless, brilliant, violent competition came an explosion of human creativity that we are still living inside today. This is the whole story. From a palace civilization that vanished so completely people forgot it existed, through the golden city of Athens, to a young king who conquered the known world before he was 33 in 20 minutes. It starts 3,500 years ago, on a sun-baked island called Crete. The first great civilization of Europe did not grow up on the mainland, but on the island of Crete, and we call them the Minoans, after their legendary king, Minos. Around 2000 before Christ, while most of Europe lived in villages, the Minoans built sprawling, multi-story palaces, the greatest at Knossos, with running water, flushing drains, grand staircases, and hundreds of rooms, so maze-like the Greeks later imagined it as the labyrinth that held the monstrous Minotaur. The Minoans were traders, not warriors. Their towns had no defensive walls because their real defense was the sea and their powerful fleet. They grew rich shipping olive oil, wine, and pottery across the Mediterranean. Their art is like nothing else in the ancient world, joyful and alive, walls painted with leaping dolphins, blue monkeys, elegant women, and young athletes vaulting over the horns of charging bulls. They worshipped goddesses and the bull, and they wrote in a script we still cannot read. And then, around 1500 before Christ, this brilliant civilization faltered and fell, weakened perhaps by a colossal volcanic eruption on a nearby island, and finally taken over by warriors from the mainland, a rougher, tougher people who would become the first true Greeks. Warriors who inherited the Aegean were the Mycenaeans, named for their greatest fortress, Mycenae, on the Greek mainland. These were the Greeks of legend, the heroes Homer would sing about 1,000 years later. Where the Minoans built open palaces, the Mycenaeans built citadels, grim fortresses of colossal stone blocks so huge that later Greeks believed only giants could have lifted them. Their kings were buried with golden death masks, bronze swords, and hoards of treasure. They were fierce, wealthy, and organized, keeping meticulous records on clay tablets in the earliest form of written Greek. And it was probably a Mycenaean king who inspired the most famous story of the ancient world, the Trojan War. Whether or not a Greek fleet truly sailed to besiege the city of Troy for 10 years over a stolen queen named Helen, there really was a rich city of Troy, guarding the straits to the Black Sea, and it really was destroyed around this time. The tale of Achilles, Hector, and the wooden horse became the Greeks' national epic, their Iliad and Odyssey, the foundation of their entire literature. But the age of heroes was about to be swallowed by centuries of darkness. Around 1200 before Christ, the entire civilized world of the eastern Mediterranean collapsed, almost all at once. We still argue about why: invasions by mysterious sea peoples, earthquakes, drought, the breakdown of trade, probably all of them together. Empires fell like dominoes, and the Mycenaean world went down with them. The great citadels were burned and abandoned, the palaces emptied, trade routes vanished, and most astonishingly, the Greeks forgot how to write. The clay tablet script simply disappeared, and for around 300 years, Greece had no writing at all. Population crashed. Villages shrank. The magnificent stone fortresses stood empty and crumbling, and the people living in their shadow could not imagine how their own ancestors had built them, so they said it must have been giants and gods. This is the Greek Dark Age, and it is exactly what the name suggests: a long, poor, illiterate silence. And yet something survived. Around their fires in the darkness, the Greeks kept telling the old stories of the heroes, passing them down by memory, generation after generation. When the light finally returned, those remembered tales, and a brand new alphabet to write them down, would help spark one of the most creative ages in human history. When Greece climbed out of the darkness, Around 800 before Christ, it reinvented itself, and the key was a new kind of community, the polis, the city-state. A polis was a single city and the farmland around it, small enough that most citizens knew each other and fiercely, obsessively independent. There were hundreds of them, and they refused to unite. This was the birth of an idea that would echo forever, that a state is not just a king and his subjects, but a community of citizens who share in governing themselves. The Greeks also borrowed the alphabet from the Phoenician traders and improved it by adding vowels, creating the ancestor of the very letters you are reading now, and suddenly they could write again. Almost immediately, someone used it to write down the old hero tales, and we got Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. As their population boomed, the crowded cities sent waves of settlers across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, founding hundreds of colonies from Spain to modern Ukraine, so that, as one philosopher joked, the Greeks sat around the sea like frogs around a pond. And in this energetic new world, two very different cities began to rise above the rest, Sparta and Athens. Sparta was unlike anything else in Greece or the world. It was a society engineered from top to bottom for one purpose: war. The Spartans had conquered their neighbors and turned an entire population into state-owned serfs called helots, who farmed the land so that Spartan men never had to work. Freed from labor, every Spartan man became a full-time professional soldier. The system was brutal. A newborn judged weak could be left to die. At 7, boys were taken from their mothers and thrown into the agoge, a savage state education of hunger, cold, beatings, and combat training designed to forge them into the finest infantry on earth. They were taught to speak in as few words as possible, which is why we still call a cutting, brief remark laconic, after Sparta's region of Laconia. Spartan women, unusually, were educated, athletic, and outspoken, running households and estates while the men lived in barracks. It produced an army whose discipline and courage were legendary across Greece, warriors who would famously rather die than retreat. But it also produced a rigid, fearful, culturally barren society, always terrified that its helots would rise up. Sparta's opposite in almost every way was the restless, brilliant, chaotic city to its north, Athens. Athens started like most city-states, ruled by wealthy aristocrats while the poor sank into debt and even slavery. It was a powder keg. But instead of exploding, Athens did something extraordinary. It reformed itself, step by step, into the world's first democracy. First came Solon, a wise lawmaker who cancelled the crushing debts and freed those enslaved for them, giving even poor citizens a voice in the assembly. After a spell under a popular strongman, a reformer named Cleisthenes went further, around 508 before Christ, reorganizing society so that power flowed from the citizens themselves. He called it democratia, people power. In this Athenian democracy, there were no professional politicians. Ordinary citizens debated and voted directly on war, laws, and money in a great open-air assembly. Juries had hundreds of members. Most public officials were chosen by lottery because the Greeks thought elections favored the rich and famous. They even invented a tool against tyranny, ostracism, where once a year citizens could scratch a dangerous man's name on a shard of pottery and vote to exile him for 10 years. It was radical, loud, and gloriously imperfect. Women, foreigners, and the enormous enslaved population were all excluded. But it was a genuinely new idea about power, and it was about to be tested by the largest empire on earth. Persian Empire was the superpower of the age, the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt to India, ruled by a king of kings. When the Greek cities of the coast of modern Turkey revolted, Athens sent ships to help them. The revolt was crushed, but the Persian king Darius never forgot the insult. In 490 before Christ, he sent a fleet across the Aegean to burn Athens to the ground. The Persians landed on a plain north of the city called Marathon. The Athenians were desperately outnumbered and, astonishingly, stood almost alone. The Spartans, delayed by a religious festival, arrived too late. Rather than wait to be besieged, the Athenian hoplites did the unthinkable. They charged a run across the open plain, straight into the Persian line. Their heavier armor and long spears tore the lightly armed Persians apart. The invaders fled to their ships, leaving thousands dead for only a couple of hundred Greeks. Legend says a runner sprinted the 26 miles back to Athens to announce the victory, gasped we win, and dropped dead, giving us the marathon race. Athens had beaten the greatest empire on earth, but the Persians would be back, and next time, in overwhelming force. 10 years later, Darius's son Xerxes came to finish the job, and he came with an army so vast the Greeks said it drank rivers dry. Hundreds of thousands of men from every corner of the empire, bridging the sea with boats to march into Greece. Terrified, most Greek cities surrendered or hid, but a coalition led by Sparta and Athens chose to fight. At a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a small Greek force, spearheaded by King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, held back the entire Persian army for 3 days in one of history's most famous last stands, until a traitor showed the Persians a path around the mountain. Surrounded, Leonidas and his Spartans fought to the last man. The Persians surged south and burned and evacuated Athens. It looked like the end. But the wily Athenian leader Themistocles had a plan. He lured the massive Persian navy into the narrow straits of Salamis, where its numbers became a curse, ships crashing into one another with no room to maneuver. The nimble Greek fleet shattered them. The next year, the Greeks crushed the Persian army on land at Plataea. Against all odds, the tiny, squabbling Greek city-states had defeated the greatest empire on earth twice. And now, Athens was about to soar. Victory transformed Athens. To guard against Persia's return, the Greek states formed an alliance and pooled their money on the island of Delos, with Athens in charge of the treasury. Slowly, that alliance became an empire. Athens moved the treasury to its own city and started spending its allies' money as if it were its own. Under its brilliant, charismatic leader Pericles, Athens used that wealth to rebuild itself as the most beautiful city in the world. On the sacred hill of the Acropolis, burnt by the Persians, they raised the Parthenon, a temple of gleaming white marble to the goddess Athena, perfectly proportioned, subtly curved to please the eye, one of the most admired buildings ever made. Athens became the cultural capital of the Greek world, drawing artists, thinkers, and traders from everywhere. Its navy ruled the Aegean. Its coins were used everywhere. Its democracy was at full, roaring life, with citizens packing the assembly and the courts. Pericles boasted that Athens was the school of all Greece, and for a few dazzling decades, it was true. But this golden age was built on an empire that the other Greeks increasingly resented, and none resented it more than the grim, watchful, militaristic rival to the south, Sparta. In this same restless, argumentative city, a handful of people invented Western philosophy, science, and theater. Earlier thinkers had already begun asking a revolutionary question: what if the world is not run by the moods of gods, but by natural laws we can understand? One imagined everything was made of invisible particles he called atoms. But the giant was Socrates, a barefoot, ugly, endlessly questioning stonemason who wandered the agora, asking people to define justice, courage, or goodness, and gently exposing that they had no idea. He wrote nothing, but he taught people to think, and the Athenians eventually executed him for it, sentencing him to drink poison hemlock for corrupting the young and questioning the gods. His student Plato founded a school called the Academy and argued that behind our messy world lies a realm of perfect ideas. Plato's student Aristotle then tried to study and classify absolutely everything: physics, biology, logic, politics, ethics, laying the foundations of science itself. Meanwhile, in a theater on the slopes of the Acropolis, the Greeks invented drama, gathering in their thousands to watch tragedies about fate and suffering, and comedies that savagely mocked their own leaders. In a single lifetime, in one small city, humanity learned new ways to think, to argue, and to see itself. The rivalry between mighty Athens, ruler of the seas, and Sparta, master of the land, finally erupted into a catastrophic conflict that dragged in almost the entire Greek world: the Peloponnesian War. It lasted, on and off, for 27 brutal years. Athens' strategy was to abandon its countryside, pull everyone behind its great walls, and rely on its navy, letting Sparta stomp around outside uselessly. It might have worked, but crowding the whole population inside the walls invited disaster. A horrific plague swept through the packed city, killing perhaps a third of the Athenians, including Pericles himself. Without his steady hand, Athenian democracy grew reckless. It launched a massive, arrogant invasion of distant Sicily that ended in total catastrophe. an entire fleet and army destroyed or enslaved. Bleeding and desperate, Athens fought on for years, but the end came when Sparta, swallowing its pride, took gold from its old enemy Persia to build a navy of its own. That fleet finally destroyed the Athenian ships. Starved into surrender, Athens saw its great walls torn down to the music of flutes. The Golden Age was over. Greece had exhausted itself, and the age of the proud, independent city-state was quietly dying, though the Greeks did not yet know it. After the Great War, the exhausted city-states kept squabbling for dominance, Sparta, then Thebes, each briefly on top, none able to hold it, all of them bleeding each other dry. The southern Greeks were so busy fighting one another that they barely noticed a new power rising in the wild, mountainous north, a kingdom they had always dismissed as half-barbarian Macedon. Its king, Philip II, was one of the great military minds of history. As a young hostage in Thebes, he had studied the best Greek warfare, and then he built something better. He created a professional standing army and armed his infantry with the sarissa, a pike so long, up to 6 meters, that his phalanx bristled like a steel porcupine, able to skewer any enemy before they could strike back. He combined this with hard-hitting cavalry, siege engines, and relentless ambition. Through war, bribery, and cunning marriage alliances, Philip picked off and dominated the Greek states one by one. When Athens and Thebes finally united to stop him, he crushed their combined army at the Battle of Chaeronea, and just like that, the free city-states of Greece belonged to Macedon. Philip planned to lead all the Greeks in a grand invasion of Persia, but at his daughter's wedding, he was suddenly assassinated. His throne and his dream passed to his 20-year-old son. His son was Alexander, and he would earn the name the Great. Tutored as a boy by none other than Aristotle, he was brilliant, fearless to the point of recklessness, and utterly convinced he was descended from heroes and gods. At 20, he inherited his father's superb army and his dream of conquering Persia, and he wasted no time. He crossed into Asia, and in a lightning series of battles, took on the largest empire on earth. At the river Granicus, then at Issus, he shattered Persian armies many times the size of his own, personally leading his cavalry in terrifying charges straight at the enemy king. He conquered the coast, took Egypt, where he founded a city named Alexandria that would become the greatest in the world, and then marched into the heart of the empire. At the colossal battle of Gorgamla, outnumbered perhaps 5-1, he smashed the full might of Persia and sent its king fleeing to be murdered by his own men. Alexander marched into the Persian capitals and took possession of treasure beyond imagining. In just a few years, a young man from a kingdom the Greeks had mocked now ruled the entire Persian Empire, from Greece to the edge of India. And still, it was not enough for him. Most conquerors would have stopped. Alexander pushed on, obsessed with reaching the end of the world. He drove his army east, through what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, fighting brutal guerrilla wars in the mountains, founding cities, and marrying a local princess named Roxana to bind his new subjects to him. He began wearing Persian dress and adopting Persian court customs, dreaming of fusing Greek and Persian into a single ruling class, which unsettled his old Macedonian veterans who had signed up to conquer Persia, not become it. Finally, he crossed into India, and at the river Hydaspes, he won a savage battle against a king with an army of war elephants, animals his men had never faced. It was one of his hardest victories. He wanted to march on, ever eastward, but at last his exhausted soldiers, thousands of miles from home and worn down by 8 years of endless war and monsoon rains, refused to take another step. Heartbroken, Alexander finally turned back. On the return, he lost countless men to a brutal desert crossing. And then in Babylon, at just 32, with the world seemingly still at his feet, Alexander suddenly fell ill and died, fever, poison, or drink, we will never know. Asked who should inherit his vast empire, he is said to have whispered, the strongest. Alexander died without a clear heir, and his empire did exactly what he predicted. It went to the strongest, or rather, to whoever could grab a piece. His leading generals, brilliant and ruthless men, fought each other for decades in wars that tore the empire apart, and finally carved it into a handful of vast kingdoms. One took Egypt, founding a dynasty of Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies, whose last ruler would be the famous Cleopatra. Another took the enormous Asian heartland. A third held Macedon and Greece. This is the Hellenistic age, and though Alexander's political empire shattered, his cultural empire triumphed. Greek became the common language of the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, spoken from Egypt to Afghanistan. Greek-style cities, with their theatres, gymnasiums, and marble temples, sprang up across 3 continents. A Greek-speaking elite ruled millions of Egyptians, Persians, and Syrians, and Greek art, coinage, and ideas blended with local cultures to create something dazzling and new. For the first time, a person could travel thousands of miles and still find familiar gods, familiar games, and a shared language. The small, quarrelsome world of the city-state had exploded outward to embrace half the known world. And in one of these new cities, human knowledge was about to reach heights not matched for over 1,000 years. The jewel of this new world was Alexandria in Egypt, and its crowning glory was the library, an audacious attempt to collect every book in the world under one roof, along with a research institute, the museum, where the state paid brilliant minds simply to think. The results were staggering. Here Euclid wrote the Elements, the geometry textbook still echoing in every classroom 2,000 years later. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the entire Earth using shadows and simple maths, and got it almost exactly right. Astronomers argued correctly that the Earth might orbit the Sun, 18 centuries before Copernicus. Heron built working steam-powered gadgets and coin-operated machines. And on the island of Sicily, the greatest of them all, Archimedes, worked out the principles of levers and buoyancy, calculated pi, and designed war machines so fearsome they held off a Roman siege for years. The Greeks had pushed mathematics, astronomy, engineering, medicine, and geography to heights that would not be surpassed until the Renaissance and beyond. It was a golden age of the human mind. But while the Greek East dazzled the world with science and culture, it had grown politically weak and divided. And far to the west, a tough, disciplined, relentlessly expanding new power was on the march. And it was looking east. The new power was Rome. And over the 2nd century before Christ, it methodically swallowed the Greek world. The Hellenistic kingdoms, for all their wealth and science, were divided and could not stand against the Roman legions. One by one they fell. Macedon was crushed and made a Roman province. The old Greek cities were defeated, and when Corinth resisted, Rome destroyed it utterly as a brutal warning. Greece became just another region of a growing empire, its long age of political freedom finally, definitively over. And yet, something remarkable happened. Rome had conquered Greece, but Greek culture conquered Rome. The tough, practical Romans were awestruck by Greek art, literature, philosophy, and science. Wealthy Romans learned Greek, hired Greek tutors, collected Greek statues, and copied Greek architecture. Roman gods merged with Greek ones. Roman writers imitated Greek models, and the highest compliment in Rome was to be cultured in the Greek manner. As the Roman poet Horace put it, captive Greece took her savage conqueror captive. The two civilizations fused into the single tradition we now call Greco-Roman, the foundation of Western culture. Greece had lost its independence, but its mind had won an empire far larger and far more lasting than anything Alexander ever dreamed of. So what did those few rocky city-states leave us? Almost the entire toolkit of Western civilization. When you vote, you are using an idea born on a hillside in Athens. When you study geometry, you are reading Euclid. When you watch a drama or a comedy, you are sitting in spirit in a Greek theater. The words for our sciences and ideas, physics, biology, democracy, philosophy, history, economics, are Greek. The Greeks gave us the Olympic Games, the foundations of medicine through Hippocrates, and the radical, world-changing conviction that the universe is not chaos, but order, something the human mind can actually understand. Their statues taught the world how to sculpt the human body. Their myths still fill our films and books. Their philosophers set the questions that thinkers have wrestled with ever since. When Rome fell, it was Greek learning, preserved in the libraries of the surviving Eastern Empire and later by Arab scholars, that helped light the fire of the European Renaissance 1,000 years later. A cluster of small, quarrelsome, sun-drenched cities that could never manage to unite somehow taught the world how to think, how to govern itself, and how to see beauty. That is the entire history of ancient Greece, and in a very real sense, we are all still its students. Thanks for watching.